So I'm one of Lindsey's biggest fans, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have her here today. She is a 2009 graduate of the MAGIC program, the Masters in Global Communications at AUP. And one of the things she excels in is communications, written communications, verbal communications. She's just an incredibly beautiful writer. And this is Lindsey's second book actually to be published, but she writes constantly. Her well-known blog called Lost in Cheeseland. I'm assuming Cheeseland, we all know Cheeseland is France with its 354 cheeses. And she weekly writes about all kinds of culinary adventures across Paris. That was later turned into a book called The New Paris, which is largely about the Paris food scene and the ways it has changed, and I would say also diversified, Lindsey. I mean, you talk about everything from what I would call haute cuisine to, you know, the latest neighborhood dive around you that you've discovered in the last couple of weeks that has really wonderful food. And this is a sort of new turn, a sort of second strike in Lindsey's career. You've now lived, I guess, 11 years, is it, in Paris?
14, if you can believe it.
Oh my goodness, 14 years in Paris. And during that time, I think acquired a French husband.
I have done that.
Check the box on that one. And so this new book is called The New Parisienne, the women and ideas shaping Paris. My contact lenses are making it hard for me to see that. And the interesting thing here is that your timing in coming out with this book this week could not be more perfect, because what you've done here is deconstruct this iconographic image of the French woman as, you know, those 1950s fashion images, and you've shown us actually how diverse and extraordinary and strong and varied French women, les Parisiennes, are. So, Lindsey, tell us all about this new project, and with your characteristic elegance and articulateness.
Well, thank you for that introduction. As Celeste mentioned, it's the second project and comes from, you know, I came at it from a place of frustration, which might sound quite negative, but actually I think that's when we start to do things that are, that challenge us and challenge what we assume to know about the world and cultures and places and people. And the first book was also sort of inspired by a frustrated feeling of the way we talk about Paris as a city and as a world capital. So in that sense, it very much is a continuation of the story. I'm going a little bit deeper. So if it's okay with everybody, what I would do is I would like to read the introduction, because I think this will give you a sense of what I am trying to accomplish with this project, and also tackle a bit about the myth and what that is and what it looks like and what's problematic about it. So I am just going to close the chat box so I don't get distracted. So, okay, let me just change the view here. Okay. A lot happened in the 9 months following the release of my first book, The New Paris. Writing a book can change a person, but so can the exchanges that emerge from its existence in the world. It connected me with readers and travelers from all over, but it also introduced me to the people right on my doorstep, many of whom were incredibly inspiring women. I've had the opportunity to write about some of them, and the more I did, the more important it became to me to share stories about the lives of women in and around Paris, how they were shaping society and culture, even in the most subtle of ways. Simultaneously, coverage about Paris, the city, and the brand carried on at a steady pace. For every article that explored the changing city were 5 that reinforced old narratives about the capital as an immaculate living museum and repackaged the same must-see lists. Along with them came an uptick in stories about how French women, consistently conflated with Parisian women, as if identical, were doing everything better, from powdering their noses to defying nature with ageless beauty techniques. I wrote the first book because I felt the city deserved better, a more complete picture of what makes it a destination for some and a home for many others. Similarly, the idea for this book was sparked at once by my desire to capture a more representative image of Paris, of the Parisian woman in all of her diversity, and by a feeling that the How to Live Like canon had reached its expiration. At its core, this book is about recasting the image of how one of the most commodified and romanticized groups of women is actually living today. How she finds happiness and seeks fulfillment. How she weathers adversity and the indignities that may be thrust upon her. And how she's contributing to the city in her own way. One dish, film, boxing match, art exhibit, podcast episode, and jewelry collection at a time. But it's also about stepping away from a restrictive set of stereotypes that have defined this one woman for generations. A woman whose aura is seemingly impossible to dispel but must endlessly be dissected, and offering a new image and a set of stories to go with it. So now I'm going to go into myth making. What do you see when you close your eyes and think of Paris? What about when you imagine the women of Paris? Chances are she's familiar. In fact, she's as familiar to us as every other Parisian icon, branded and brandished like a symbol of national grandeur. Yet for all of her familiarity, the Parisienne isn't what she always appears to be. Seduction, style, beauty, and attitude have been seen as the marker and measure of the Parisian female mystique for generations. We speak little of her mind, her ambitions, her career, or her life experiences detached from her physical body. Instead, we focus on her collection of handbags and striped sailor tops, her innate ability to ride a bicycle across town in heels, or let her hair loose with uncalculated abandon. Even the mundane of the everyday takes on a mystical elan, her face magnified by the deep red lip we're told she sports as a sign of her boldness, whether she's picking up the dry cleaning or heading out for dinner. It's an engineered, pervasive, and deeply troublesome myth that impacts not only the foreign women who are meant to consistently feel lacking and continue buying, literally, into the idea that a cream top or hairbrush will put them on the path to betterment, but the local women who don't hew to the mold popular culture has co-opted. It's an archetype that effaces Black, Asian, disabled, trans, and other countless segments of the population with such ease that you, the consumer and traveler, come to Paris and are slack-jawed by the diversity. The Parisienne has been flattened to caricature in a way that does as much harm to her as everyone aspiring to be her. For this issue, we can thank brands, marketers, women's magazines, and books, the greatest proselytizers of the branded Parisian woman. Even some of the most famous Parisian faces have capitalized on what they know to be a mirage to sell a fantasy. And it's worked. This hegemonic figure, intellectual perhaps, but mostly seductive, chic no matter the circumstances, always perfectly composed, has sold billions of dollars worth of perfumes, lipsticks, entire wardrobes, and even attitudes. Today, there are a staggering number of brands that have been created to sound and feel French. French Girl Organics, Glossier, Way Hair Care, Être Cécile, and La Garçonne, among others, are all designed to deliver on a lifestyle ambition that itself has been implanted over generations and run exclusively on perceived value. All over the world, the average reader and consumer falls victim to the illusory truth effect, the idea that the more we're exposed to something, the more likely we believe it, whether or not it's true. And in this case, the Parisian beauty ideal trumps all else. Even as far back as the 18th century, the stereotypes of the Parisienne were well established. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and work by his predecessors had already begun sketching images of the Parisienne, whose reputation was intricately connected to her proximity to the royal court. But it was largely Rousseau, in one of his most widely read works, called Julie or the New Eloise, published in 1761, who depicted the Parisienne across social classes as inordinately concerned with fashion and artifice as a symbol of status, preoccupied with drawing attention to herself, and talented in seduction, laying the groundwork for many of the associations that developed later. Parisian elegance and refinement in dress, appearance, and manner, as it became prized in the following century, wasn't reserved for the elite. That emphasis trickled down to the most modest working class girls. The rise of structured prostitution up through the Belle Époque largely fed the myth of the erotic Parisienne, an association that evolved further with the rise of pleasure houses and hedonist theaters. And the first modern department store, Le Bon Marché, cannot be overlooked for its role in cultivating the image of the modern, modish Parisienne and spreading it beyond French borders. The store, opened in 1852 by Aristide and Marguerite Boucicaut, revolutionized the retail experience and established a model of modern commerce that laid the foundation for stores all over the world, from Macy's to Selfridges. Monsieur Boucicaut incited desire by allowing women to touch and try products. Prices were fixed, and he ran occasional sales, replenished stock, and rolled out seasonal fashions that inspired the Parisian woman to reinvent herself incessantly. As a result, women from outside of Paris flocked to the store, some even applying for jobs. The Parisian woman was now admired for the multitude of representations that writers, painters, and popular culture built around her, and those images would follow her in various forms up to and after World War II. With her garçon style, Chanel stepped in and rocked fashion by freeing women from corsets and oppressive garments, and Brigitte Bardot, the inveterate coquette, anchored the Parisian to an image of sexual revolution and liberty in the 1960s and 1970s that has yet to be shaken off for a foreign audience. A combination of those long-standing associations carry over into the modern image of the Parisian woman that's played out over and over again, set to the backdrop of her city, equally as romanticized. Paris is Kate Moss's co-star, for example, in the ad campaign for Yves Saint Laurent's perfume, Parisienne, the two myths, city and woman, converging into one unmistakable image: luxury, elegance, femininity, and money. The myth retains its power, even finding ways to be reinvented through its legacy and a whole database of images and cliches used by the industries of fashion, advertising, and tourism, writes historian Emmanuel Retailleau-Bajec. In other words, it doesn't matter if there is truth behind the stereotypes, there's enough material to keep the lore alive. So where does that leave us today? With what Nigerian novelist and feminist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the single story, when complex people are reduced to a single narrative. While she used the misconceptions of Africans as her primary example in her viral TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, she noted the universality of a limited perspective. The pernicious, narrow view of Parisian women as white, heterosexual, thin, seductive, and concerned with superficial matters is capitalized on, repurposed and recirculated as novelty by tourism boards, magazines, books, and brands. And it is dangerous for the same reasons that Adichie highlighted in her talk. She said the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And as a result, it strips people of their humanity. For Alice Pfeiffer, the Franco-British journalist and the author of the book Je'09 pas Parisienne, which looked at the myth of the Parisian in fashion history, it's a story that fits the image the country wants to portray. It works in France's favor to keep whitewashing its image. Then they don't have to address their colonial past, she says. And so what is that ideal today? She tells me the May 1968 prematernal body, reflected by figures such as Jane Birkin, Françoise Hardy, or France Gall. And that became the one face of liberation that stuck forever, which virtually no one can attain. Or at least it hinges upon only a select few being able to mimic it, but everyone else absolutely believing they might be able to. This creates a distorted standard of personal worth, where the unachievable is perpetually presented as the golden ticket to happiness. For too many years, I genuinely believed that if I just followed the trends and bought that scarf and that bag and pushed myself hard enough at the gym, I'd blend into the mold and become the ultimate version of myself. It's hard to say what the bigger betrayal was: the lies I was told about the way Parisian women behaved and lived, or being hoodwinked by them for so long. The danger in anchoring the Parisian woman to a white, heteronormative standard, whatever the ill-founded reasons may be, is that it leaves little to no room for the rest of the population. Society has reached an impasse in the way women are portrayed universally. If women are actively demanding change around the world, why should it be any different in Paris? Why should an entire set of the French population be reduced to one or two qualifiers? When I look around me as I navigate the city, almost none of the women I observe resemble the effete avatar so neatly painted for us. The woman I see is white, Black, Arab, Jewish, Muslim, Asian, African, South American, slender, curvy, petite, and sky high. Some are in wheelchairs, some have style, some are indifferent to whatever the Western ideas of style imply. Some believe makeup is a form of self-expression, while others shy away from the unwanted attention it may bring. They are teachers, shopkeepers, entrepreneurs, mothers, mentors, writers, singers, artists, innovators, chefs, and all far more than the sum of their experiences. They are Parisienne, not necessarily born in the city or even born in France, but residents of the city of Paris and its bordering suburbs. The women in this book, like the millions of other women that walk the city with them, aren't new in the sense that they are novel. They've always been here, but rarely do they get the spotlight or the megaphone that they deserve. So that gives you a little bit of background on what laid the groundwork for this project. And I go on to describe some of the themes that are recurring in the book. So I actually give a cultural primer where I talk about issues like laïcité, which is France's version of secularism, talk about national identity, talk about race and the issue of communautarisme, which is sort of a rejection of multiculturalism in order to preserve universalist values under the French Republic. I talk about feminism and sort of what the emerging philosophies are in that movement today. And all of that because I think that in order to understand some of the backlash that some of these women face for their opinions, why some of them felt very committed to certain causes, why they feel they had to work extra hard in their fields, it isn't enough to say that, you know, because it's a Western European country or capital that things operate the same as they might in the US or even in the UK. The truth is that some of these issues are handled much differently. And so that plays a role in why some of these women feel the way they do. So for me, it was important to give context as to, you know, how these issues have played out historically, how they're perceived now, maybe why they continue to be problematic, and then go into profiles and interviews and conversation with a whole series of women who are from all walks of life, different professional backgrounds. And as I said, many of them are not born in France. So, you know, when we think about the Parisian population, you know, you start speaking to people and quite quickly you realize how many people surround you that have made Paris their home, but are actually from, you know, one of the nearby suburbs or somewhere else in Europe or even much further afield. So it's a way for me to say that there's a reason we need to take this seriously in the way that we talk about women and using Paris as a sample, because ultimately people care about Paris. We know that. And the fantasy of the woman is so ingrained that it sort of serves as an example for the way we need to change the narrative in the way we talk about women everywhere. So if people will listen because we're talking about Paris, then great, but the message applies universally. So with that, I thought maybe we could have a conversation. If people have questions, we can talk, we can decipher this further. We can, if you'd like to hear about one woman in particular, I can do that as well, but thought I'd see what the consensus was.
So we have comments and people who are happy to be here, but no specific questions right now. So I love that idea. And
Okay.
but please let me remind you all that we should be using the chat box to log any questions or comments for this discussion so it can be interactive. And I'll say that Joan just logged on here. This is wonderful, Lindsay, and can enable more, oh, here we go, and can enable more solidarity and empathy among women around the world. Mimi Stenson asks, feminist movement in France?
Also, actually, that brings up an interesting, I mean, I can actually read a little bit from the section where I talk about how feminism has evolved here, because it does function slightly differently from, you know, even in the US, which has been intersectional, at least in focus for much longer than it has here. So great. But I start there and then we can go on. So feminism in France has evolved considerably since Simone de Beauvoir published The Second Sex. Many of the feminist activists in the book have made it clear that the word alone, slowly but surely, is shaking off its taboo. Still, feminists find themselves having to reiterate that feminism isn't about gender wars, but about a social movement fighting for equality and against sexist oppression. And they're doing so in a variety of different ways. Today, there are as many interpretations of feminism as there are women, with micro movements within that fight for equality. Clear distinctions in ideology, however, can be made. When it comes to the self-identified feminists in this book, they generally adhere to an intersectional approach. While they are among the most vocal, they know they have yet to tip the balance and become the majority. French feminism has long had a reputation for universalism and gender essentialism, and therefore has been generally aligned with patriarchal ideology. Its most prominent figures have been white, bourgeois, cisgendered, and able-bodied, and share the opinion that the fight is more or less the same for all women. In the eyes of feminist fashion journalist and author Alice Pfeiffer, the particularity of these French feminists is that they are more interested in speaking for their privileged class and maintaining their positions within it than speaking for their entire gender. As she puts it, the dominant contingent is against the headscarf, pro-sex in a way that seems apologetic to male sexuality, anti-pornography and prostitution, believes that dressing sexy is a sign of gender betrayal, and that feminism should have limits. And this makes you instantly think of the letter that was written, or the manifesto that was written in 2018 by Catherine Deneuve and Catherine Millet, denouncing Me Too and defending une liberté d'importuner indispensable à la liberté sexuelle. So how men should have the freedom to bother, a concept indispensable to sexual freedom. In other words, a man's right to seduce. So this philosophy is perhaps best represented by Elisabeth Badinter, among the country's most widely known universalist feminists and intellectuals, and the most mainstream insofar as her books, often controversial, on the culture of motherhood and women's independence have been national bestsellers. The causes she has championed over the years have also been subject to controversy, particularly her public support for the 2005 headscarf ban and the 2011 burqa law, as she believes these dress codes are oppressive largely because they are traditional. In an open letter to Muslim women at the time of the vote, Badinter wrote, "I believe that what's good for me, liberty, is good for you," which is another way of saying the traditions of other cultures are necessarily an impediment to women's freedoms, and therefore this must be done to protect them. The emerging generation of feminist voices, some of whom you'll read about in the book, insists that it's not about wearing the headscarf or opting not to, rejecting cosmetics or adornment, losing weight or gaining it, surgically transforming our bodies or leaving them be, having 5 kids or 5 cats, pursuing a career or staying home to raise children. It's about having the freedom to choose without judgment. They are adamant that intersectionality, a theory developed in the United States in the late 1980s by civil rights advocate and scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, that only found a footing in France in the last few years, is the only way forward. In feminism, intersectionality suggests that the fight for equality isn't created equal by nature of the disadvantages and inequalities that many non-white, non-binary, non-able-bodied women face. Those oppressions take different forms and often compound themselves, as does a person's ability to resist and navigate them, but are largely based on constraints that attends one's class, race, sexual orientation, nationality, and religion. Recognizing and understanding these different dimensions, as Rebecca Amsalem, a feminist profiled in the book, tells me, it's an act of solidarity to recognize and understand them. So that's part of the cultural primer as a way to, provide an introduction to the feminist rhetoric and conversations that come up actually quite often in the book. And not everyone identifies as a feminist, and it's not, as I said, it's a word that is starting to shake off its taboo everywhere. But ultimately, I think there are a lot of women who identify with certain key values and believe that certain priorities need to be taken more seriously on a governmental level, but aren't necessarily, militant activists, may not be marching in the street, but are still understanding and learning about how the many different ways that oppressions against women remain in place, frankly, whether it's through wage inequality, not being able to ascend into certain positions, our reproductive rights, the way that we're treated in the public sphere, online. I mean, it's endless. So it remains one of the red threads through the book, I think, is how women are navigating these issues, whether they, call themselves feminists or not.
So that's really interesting, because what you've just defined is really a generation or a generation and a half, if I'm doing my math right, of some of the same struggles, but that it has in fact evolved in unexpected ways in the middle, and here we are back talking about, as you said, losing its taboo again. It's a very interesting discussion. Thank you. I wonder, and someone has suggested, if you could just maybe pick a couple people you profiled in the book and tell us
talk
more
about them
in your conversation. Yes.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, they kind of span all different fields. And what I've done is I've broken down, categorized, so to speak, based on sort of affinities. So I look at activists, and in that section, I profile Rokhaya Diallo, who is the most prominent anti-racist activist, but she's also a journalist and a documentary filmmaker, and regular commentator on radio and on television. And she's been at the forefront of the discussion that's erupted again in the last month, specifically about police violence and the Black community in France. But I also speak with a woman named Elisa Rojas, who is an employment lawyer and a disability rights activist. And it's interesting because when I wanted to make sure that I had a good representation of careers within the book, I didn't necessarily, say, oh, I want a lawyer who also, does other things. But the reality is that, no one is just their profession. And so her legal training actually really gave her sort of the tools to better understand the injustices that exist within the disabled community in France, and how to protect herself and to protect others. So I thought that was really interesting to uncover, and some of the biggest problems for those who are not able-bodied in France. So obviously this goes beyond Paris, but is institutionalization, which is still used as sort of the primary solution, so to speak, in dealing. And I use these words intentionally to highlight the way sort of the government and the state looks at disabled individuals. So they're handled, they're sort of treated like a burden. And so they're put in these institutions where they're told that they will get their best care and they have access to education and all these other things, except that they're sources of tremendous social isolation and strips many of them, especially those who could be contributing in society and who, are not, don't have any impediment to their cognitive functioning or their ability to be part of the workforce. They look at that as a way to sort of just shut them down and not adapt society to their needs, versus, they're supposed to sort of adapt to society, which is not the way the conversation should go. So I learned a tremendous amount from her. And so those are a couple of examples in the activists, and then I have the creators. So in that I have an architect, a filmmaker, a singer-songwriter who also is an activist. So I didn't put her in the activist category, but she's mostly known as for her other talents. A jewelry designer, and two women who have founded different companies, one based on antiquing and the love of gathering. And that's another American, she's Nigerian American, and her company is called Madame de la Maison, and her story is fascinating. And another woman who used to work for Colette, right out of college, she worked for the concept store Colette, and then created two other brands, including the one that she runs now with her husband, called l'Officine Universelle Bully, which is a sort of a natural cosmetics and skincare company. So they're very interesting because within that group alone, you have a Lebanese woman, an Italian woman, a Nigerian American woman, a French woman born in Champagne, in the Champagne region. And then you have another woman, Victoire de Taillac, who is also French. But all that to say, I could have come up with 50 other examples for each chapter, and the diversity, which, is a word that also is being debated quite heavily right now. I mean, it leads you to believe that white is the standard. And so we're talking about other backgrounds, other ethnicities, but I also mean a multitude of voices, and within each section, I could have gone on forever. There are the disruptors, and so in that I include the mayor, Anne Hidalgo, who, especially among the people who dislike her, is very much a disruptor and are disrupting their way of life. But also an aeronautical engineer, a woman, a social entrepreneur who founded a company called La Lab, which gives a voice to Muslim women in France. There's the wonderful, wonderful rabbi Delphine Orveilleur, who's only one of 3 female rabbis in France. And what's interesting to know about her is that she was ordained in New York because the sort of central hub of Jewry in France refused to ordain her, because for them, which remains extremely orthodox, women cannot take on that role. There's an Olympic medalist boxer who's become an entrepreneur as well. So anyway, these are women who are disrupting their fields, disrupting norms, and I think are doing, are becoming more and more visible as these discussions become slightly more mainstream. There are storytellers. So within that, there is Layla Slimani, who's an award-winning author. There's also Heidi Evans, who created the Women of Paris tours. But there's also Poonam Shavla, who is the cultural guide, author, and translator. And her son, Pushan, went to AUP. And that's how actually I met her, is through him. Her story is incredible as well, and the work that she does to highlight the Indian community in Paris. And then the tastemakers, because of course, as Celeste mentioned in the beginning, I have had quite a lot of experience writing about the people in food. And so I did want to make sure I still gave a nod to them. And so there's the head coffee roaster of one of the leading the leading coffee roasters in Paris, called Belleville Brûlerie. The roasting operation is run by a woman. We have Myriam Sabé, who's the pastry chef behind and owner of Maison Aleph, which does Levantine pastries. Margot Le Carpentier, who's the founder of Combat Cocktail Bar. And Moko Hirayama, who owns Moko Nuts and is the lead baker. And they're just a wonderful group of women who are challenging, I guess, the things that both the traditions within their industries, and also the role of women and how quickly they can ascend when they're given certain opportunities. The visionaries. So again, I could have called these women a whole bunch of other things as well, but within that group, we have an urban strategist who's really trying to rethink the way we build and structure the city, and how women can navigate the city. Is it safe for them? How do we make it better? How do we make it more accessible? Sandra Ray, who actually I just saw this morning briefly to check in with her, and she's the CEO of a company called Glowy, which uses bioluminescent technology as a light source. And she was named one of MIT Magazine's, brightest under 30 a couple of years ago, and is really using technology and science in interesting ways, which will hopefully go on to overhaul the way we even light our cities. So hopefully that's going to take some research and development, but basically pulling, technology or the what is it called? The element within fish that allows them to light up, and incorporating that into the research in sort of light and design. Anyway, fascinating. And then Kat Borlangon, who's the director of French Tech, which is the government's startup and digital arm, focusing on really making Paris into the startup hub that it has aspirations to be. And she is not only a woman, but she's from the Philippines originally. She has started her own company before joining the French Tech, and she has also worked for Reporters Without Borders and studied all over the world. So, we're talking about women who have experienced so many different things and have been so many places and are choosing to start their work and really push their work further in Paris. And so I think that's a really interesting way of considering who, as we walk down the streets in Paris and we see these faces and maybe we imagine what they do. Well, some of them are doing really important things that could, potentially change the face of the city one day. And then in the last section, I have 5 women who share sort of their ideal itineraries for Paris. And that's a way for me to also highlight some other women who are, you know, engaging and have great taste and are, you know, thought leaders in their own right, and connect with the other theme of the book, which is each of the individuals you'll meet, whether it's through interviews or profiles, at the end, they all provide some of their favorite addresses and experiences in Paris. And I did that because I wanted there to be quite a close tie to the first book, which allowed readers to potentially use the book also as a sort of guide, or just to inspire some of the outings they might make when they come here. And so I was actually quite blown away by how many people used the first book as a guide, given that it's about the same size as this one, and, you know, it doesn't fit in your pocket. But that didn't seem to stop people from, you know, really taking the information and allowing it to inform their travel. So that's also why there's that theme in this book as well. But I think what you know, if you do choose to pick it up, I think you'll see that, you know, we all have a lot in common, and maybe we just need to talk to each other more, because I found that my worldview and many of my opinions changed or became stronger after talking to these women. And I think that now we're in a period of more open dialogue. I think, you know, many of us, especially those who have come through AUP and are already very, very international, you know, enjoy that dialogue and disagreeing and learning from each other. And this is certainly a moment where we need to be doing that quite actively. And I hope that this book also serves as a reminder for the power that we can wield through these kinds of conversations.
Wow, that's great. I'm sure everyone on this call can't wait to read it. I mean, you really paint such a wonderful picture of the people that you profiled. So we really can't wait. And I had no idea about that end section. So it just sounds brilliant. Thank you. A few questions have come in. Christina, I'm going to hold yours for a minute because I think it's terrific. Two comments I'd like to put out here in front of you. Diana Colson says this: really interesting. I personally feel that female equality is pretty strong in France compared to some other developed countries. In the 25 years I've lived here in several different professional environments, I can count on one hand the times I've felt I'm being treated in a particular way because I'm a woman. Have I just been lucky? Do others feel this way? So put that to one side for a second. And then Edie Wiltsey writes, I have two, she is a member of the founding classes. So one of the earliest classes.
Wow, okay.
And her sister Mimi have been on many of these calls. We're so thrilled to have you and everyone else. But Edie writes, I have two AUP classmates who married Frenchmen, and after the initial dazzle wore off, ended up feeling oppressed in a traditional French marriage. Both ended up divorced. Can you comment on what it's like today for foreign women who become Parisiennes by marriage? So those are two different.
Oh boy. Okay.
You can put them separately. I thought they were just interesting and constant.
No, they're quite parallel. To Diana's question, I think I don't know. Maybe you have been lucky. It also might depend on the work environment. I previously, before I was solely freelancing, I was working in advertising and doing writing in that kind of an environment. And you can imagine, actually, there's a woman who, in the book also, Christelle Delarue, she created an advertising agency that focuses on sort of breaking stereotype in communication and marketing because it's so problematic. But she speaks to the experience working in advertising agencies with, you know, sort of this bro culture that's very, very much commonplace. And so that being my experience as well, I always felt that either there were things that were permitted to happen or to be said. And this is pre-Me Too, however. So, you know, I'm hoping that things have changed since then. But I do believe that there were certain expectations, certain salaries that I've had that I do believe were what they were because I was a woman. There's also a lot of ageism, I think, in France as well. And that kind of, again, runs alongside issues of, you know, different treatment due to gender. and so I also thought that, given some of my experiences in the past, that I was paid less, not only because I was a woman, but because also I was considered young by whatever standard they were. The barometer was not very clear because, on paper it looks like you have enough experience. So I don't know. I don't think there's a perfect answer for this. And I think you'll see actually that many of the women who work in more traditional corporate environments, or even within small startups that are, mixed men and women in the book, they'll talk about, maybe incidents that have made them feel inferior due to being female. But all the better if you have not had that experience. That's what we want. But I don't know. I think it does depend. On the marriage question, I don't know. I do think I know plenty of people who have divorced their French partners here as well. And I think, I don't know if we can generalize. I don't know that, maybe there's more openness from French individuals, whether it's men or women, in being open to what it means to be with someone foreign, and to sort of embrace those cultural differences that are invariably going to impact your daily life and your relationship. Maybe there's less of the dominant, male dominant, if we're talking about a heterosexual couple anyway, that kind of like very macho, I'm in control of the household kind of thing. I know that less and less is there pressure on having kids, at least among my friend group. And so that's less of a source of conflict within these couples. Although there seems to be still the same amount of tension with the in-laws as ever. So I don't know. I think it's really hard to say. I think I can speak for myself that, I'm with someone who I guess tends to appreciate that I have a stronger personality than him. And he lets me lead in a lot of ways. And his sort of calmness and introverted qualities actually balance with my personality. And so we've managed to grow together. It hasn't always been easy, but we've grown together. And I think there are for some French men in particular. So again, I'm only speaking about hetero couples right now, but I think that a lot of French men dislike the powerful, outspoken woman because they've been raised in environments where the woman was not supposed to be that way. And maybe in other cultures, that's, slightly less of the abiding issue in a couple. I don't know. That's a roundabout way of saying I'm not sure if this actually answers your question.
Well, it's interesting because you have the perspective of someone who is 50 years out from that question and someone who is more recent.
Right.
So thank you. That was really helpful. I want to go back to Jasmine. Mentioned somebody that you actually mentioned, but maybe you could say one or two more things about Heidi Evans. Jasmine says that she saw Heidi Evans post about your book on her Women of Paris account.
Yes.
Talk a little bit more about what she shares about history of women in Paris. And you said something about women's tours.
Yeah, so her company is called Women of Paris, and it's a series of thematic tours that bring visitors or locals, if they choose to sign up, on walking tours that highlight the great women that have marked Parisian history. And she started that company because she was working as a guide for a bunch of different companies and realized that the stories, the sort of historical journey that most of the guides take people on is very focused on the valiant men who have shaped the city and influenced the city. And like occasionally some of the bad women will get, mentions, or the rebellious women. And the way we're framing it is always the same. And it was sort of an afterthought. No, she realized that she couldn't even name, after having studied art and culture in university, she couldn't even name, more than one painter, perhaps, whose female painter, whose work is displayed at the Musée d'Orsay. And no one, I mean, you get travelers who come and they have maybe a baseline knowledge of, iconic names in art, culture, and architecture, and then nowhere do they have much of a working understanding of the women. And so she said, this is a problem because if we're going to start to talk about the women who are shaping Paris today, and eventually consider them in future tours, we have to get the backstory right. So she'll focus on tours that involve the literary figures. She'll focus on some of the jazz musicians and dancers and other types of prominent figures that have marked Parisian history. And she does mention some more contemporary women like Simone Weil, who was, the reason we have access to abortion in France, and who was buried in the Pantheon when she died 2 years ago. And so she's one of the most beloved figures in France. And it's only sort of now that we talk about her as often as we do. I think there was a period when she was, passing the law that she was constantly in the news. And then now when you think about, how often we talk about the women who have, or just individuals who have given certain rights to citizens, she's like the only name that would come up, and not even all that frequently. So we talk about her a lot now after she has died, of course. But, we could be talking about a whole slew of other contemporary figures. So I think her work is really trying to say that there's a whole side of even historic Paris that you're not getting if you're not seeking out some of these tours that do a better job of giving the education that they're supposed to give. Because ultimately a walking tour is a mini education. Yeah. It's fun, it's lighthearted, but you are supposed to learn something. And that means there is more responsibility on the guide or the cultural leader to incorporate those stories properly.
Great, thank you. I look forward to being able to go on a walking tour of Paris. Many of us are not there now. Barbara Reno asks asks if you would comment about any observations you have about Brigitte Macron. Barbara mentioned a quote where she heard, after being questioned about their 24-year marriage age difference, said something along the lines of, "Yes, we meet at breakfast each morning, me with my wrinkles and him with his youth."
I think we actually haven't been hearing much about or from Brigitte in a very long time. I think, unfortunately, the role of sort of French First Lady is purely symbolic. I mean, she doesn't quite have the same projects or ambitions as an American First Lady. And there was a lot of joking and speculation around their marriage when he was running for president, and it's still sort of it still comes up as the butt of a joke every so often. I will say it must be incredibly difficult in this climate and in this country to be a woman who every time she is photographed going outside is scrutinized. So she always looks put together. She's always wearing, incredible heels and things that look very uncomfortable. But when you actually think about the expectations in having such a public facing role that she did or didn't choose, that's their private their private life. But I think there's a lot of pressure, and so I'm a little bit more sympathetic to her, regardless of how I might think it's a bit strange, their relationship when he was a high school student, and without going into that, I do sympathize with what it must be like to be a woman, constantly picked apart in the media, especially here. Yeah.
I'd like to turn around. We have just a few more minutes, and I want to now go to our beloved Christina Keenan is on the call. Delighted to see you. And Christina, we're delighted to see you, so welcome. And she has given us a softball question, which of course I love, which is this: how did your AUP Magic program prepare you for a career in writing, blogging, podcasting, publishing, etc.? And huge congratulations. But thank you for that question, Christina, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on how the Magic program.
Well, what was instrumental in that program was the balance of theory and practice. And I was more than thrilled to get the theoretical foundation, but I also wanted to understand how to apply it. And that's what the program offered, whether it was the group projects, and I know it's evolved even further now, since podcasting is now a common tool. I'm sure that's been woven into the curriculum. But essentially, I was in class with not only professors who had been in, the working world, but also classmates who had already experienced, some of these tools we were learning about in action. And so it was a combination of learning from them and then getting the chance to actually apply what I was learning in agencies and in the corporate world, and understand, like, okay, what are the tools they actually need? What do I need to be bringing to the table? And with that thinking, I think all of it is about preparing you for the thinking that you're going to have to do, and you should be preparing yourself to do once you are in a different working environment. And also, I think the timing was really interesting because I was finishing right as some of these social platforms were exploding. So I remember when I graduated and I was still trying to figure out what my next move was going to be, that's when I created the blog, because because blogging was becoming a thing and we were talking about it. And I got on Twitter, and Twitter was still, not very popular, especially in France. But it was sort of, I just let myself dive in, and I kind of taught myself, it's not like we're learning how to physically use Twitter in the program, but the fact that I was already more open to it meant that I could see a direct correlation to what I was learning and the sort of curiosity around these tools and in the types of communicating in a broad sense of the word that I would be doing in the working world, just made me all the more eager to sort of get in and figure things out and figure out how it worked. So I think that's ultimately the biggest sort of, for me, the direct application of the program was becoming a person and a thinker who was curious about these tools and how it would impact my own self-expression and how it can be used within, nonprofits or companies to do important work, or how it can be a tool for controversy, how it can be, a source of tension. But ultimately, I think I didn't have the brain or the perspective before the program that I needed ultimately to do all the things that I've been doing.
That's great. Thank you. We forget that 10 years ago, Twitter was relatively brand new.
Yes, it's been a long time.
Yes. But I remember listening to Barack Obama campaigning and saying, I can't use something with only 117 characters. And of course, how the world has changed. So we're glad to know
exactly. That everyone can.
Yes, everyone can. And thank you for that little vote of confidence. Waddick did a program for us last week and talked about just that, theory and practice as the basis for communications at AUP. So delighted to have someone as exceptional as you vouching for it now. As we close, the people who are return customers here will know that we always try to end these programs with one big question or one key theme you'd like us to take away, ideally to talk about in our next Zoom conversation with family and friends, Zoom receptions we're all having every day, week, and month. So if you had one takeaway or thought besides buy this book and we all can't wait, maybe you could tell us something you'd really like us to take away today.
Well, if you think about just what we've all been living, and some are still very much living with respect to the pandemic, there's a clear parallel with many of the themes that are discussed in the book and sort of the inequalities that most women, even in France, still face, and the pandemic. So what I would say is, think about this fact that has been shared also by the World Health Organization and many other groups that are supporting and working toward protecting rights for women, is that COVID-19 has been the biggest setback to gender equality in a decade. So just, I would say, sit on that and think about how that translates. So, women losing paid work and doing more unpaid work as a result of the pandemic. Think about the work that is at home in caregiving that's never paid. Female entrepreneurs needing help. Full economic parity was already, over 250 years away worldwide, even before the crisis. And now I mean, it's just being pushed back further. Think about the companies that will try to save money and come up with excuses to pay their workers differently. And also the frontline workers who are predominantly female, and of, you know, women of color are also among sort of the highest percentage of individuals who are working in, you know, sanitation, in hospitals, in restaurants, in all of the sort of essential businesses that we need during this time. So unfortunately, the consequences of a pandemic go far beyond the economy and our health, but also the progress we were making in terms of gender parity. It's not a positive note to end on, but it's still important.
It's really important to keep center, and so thank you for that. Before we ask Celeste to wrap up, I need to make our thank you, Lindsey, on behalf of everybody on this call, so much for this. And
Thank
we'll
you.
have one more word on that in a second. And before we have that one more word, I want to invite everyone, including Lindsey, to join us on Monday for our very last AUP to You program of the season. We'll be back in the fall. Celeste, our new board chair, Doris Downey, a member of the founding classes, Mimi Svensson, whose sister Edie Wiltsey asked a question earlier, and a rising senior, Leela Roker, will join us for a roundtable discussion about AUP, our past and our future. And so we hope everyone on the call will join us. And I'd also like to again thank everyone who has made a financial commitment to support these programs and the university in this moment. And we can't thank you enough for your generosity, and hope that if you're able to consider a gift to AUP at this time, that you will. So Celeste, would you like to have a final word here?
No, I was just thinking during your talk how much your work actually exemplifies what we're about at AUP. You know, respect for this kind of difference, all kinds of cross-cultural dialogues, moving across cultures. So many of the women that you described, you know, are in that position. And I was also thinking, what a great role model you are for young women. We got to get you to campus this fall. You need to come and talk to students about how you made some of these choices. Mm-hmm. You're an example of somebody who kind of invented your own job while you were in the process of looking for one. And that's what so many young people want to do today. They don't want to just join a company and be with Publicis, you know, for the next 20 years of their lives. And I think students would actually love to know how exhilarating and scary that probably was to do. And then what some of the forces are in the world that you can play with and play upon to be able to make happen your dream. And so we're going to have to get you to campus soon.
With pleasure. I'll come back anytime.
Terrific. I'll talk to you about that September 1st.
Sounds good.
Okay. Great to see you, Lindsey. Thank you.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you for coming, everybody. Our hour is up. Lindsey, thanks a million. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.